Welcome to our new series on the New Covenant, Part 2, Electric Boogaloo. So, if any of you have been around for the last one, you would know that hold on. If any of you, yeah, if then you would know that we went into the New Covenant. Not only did I do a presentation on the New Covenant way before as part of a paper, but then I did a series of 11 videos. I think it was around 11 videos or 12, depending, on specifically the New Covenant and all of the problems associated with it in dispensationalism and how people interpret it throughout the years. And now we're actually going to go into even deeper, specifically into how people explain the different views, they defend the different views, and sort of looking at the debate surrounding everything with it, as well as the main players in the game, how we even know what is a New Covenant passage. So this is Professor Banana Class 102. See, before was 101, and I'm assuming you watched 101. So now we're into 102, Expanded and Enhanced Edition. I don't know if you've ever seen GTA 5 Expanded and Enhanced. you know what that is. So, and it's by me. My name is Sean. I will be your professor. As a side point, people have criticized me for using the name professor when I'm not actually one. It's okay. Just got out of work. What did I miss? No, you didn't miss anything. You did not miss anything. We are just starting. You're just in time. Okay. So, introduction. Again, the class is back in session and we're back to school. Now, technically, school started in September already, so we're a little bit late to that, but we should be out by your December break. So that should be good. We're going over another book about the New Covenant by Mike Stallard. Now, just to preface, this one will be shorter. It's a shorter book. There's less authors in it, generally, and it's just it's only 6 chapters. Last one was 11 chapters. This one is only 6, so it should be good. And the title is Dispensational Understanding of the New Covenant. The purpose of it is to give 3 distinct views within the New Covenant within dispensationalism, which, by the way, those 3 views, to preface, are the Israel-only view, which on this channel I believe and Kurt believes. Layman does not, but that's okay. And Quad in the chat also believes. And the other view is the indirect relationship to the New Covenant. That's probably more of Charles' style, as well as most dispensationalists. And the direct relationship with the New Covenant, that's more of a progressive dispensationalist style, and some other sort of revised dispensationalism. Lol. Okay. It's okay. Now, what is the end result of our study? The end result, hopefully, for any heretics out there, is to have a better, more comprehensive knowledge of the debates surrounding the New Covenant. I'm not here to tell you everything about it and every passage and exegete every single one. We kind of went through all that before. The purpose is just to know what the issues are so that you could just know why people debate about it. That's really the main thing. So, now, what is a recap? So this is just going over what we already did in our last class, 101. We've already gone through and observed the major New Covenant texts from different angles, either just going through them chronologically, seeing the development of how God is revealing that covenant plan, as well as looking at them in a sort of canonical sense, looking at them in the canon, how the Jews ordered their New Covenant passages, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and so on. Hi, PBT. Hey, what's up, Lynn? What is going on? We have already laid out in the main views of the New Covenant. Technically, there were 5, even within, we include the one from Reformed theology, which is that the New Covenant is already fulfilled, the church is Israel, that kind of stuff, as well as a participation view. We have gone through and exegeted carefully every single text in the New Testament that people think supports present New Covenant fulfillment. This includes things like Acts chapter 2, Acts chapter 15, sometimes Romans chapter 11, I believe it was the entire book of Hebrews, specifically 7 to 10. And I also believe there was another one. Oh, the Lord's Supper, those passages as well. PB, will Layman come soon and cut it short? No, I don't think he'll cut it short. I think that Layman, I told him that he should come in, when the stream is almost done, because it will be pretty short. This will not be like a 3-hour stream like usually. We have shown the socio-political ramifications of thinking the new covenant is in operation. We have shown the church's relationship today to future new covenant installment in the kingdom. This is more of a socio-political sort of idea, like, okay, we know the new covenant is not fulfilled yet, okay, but it will be fulfilled with Israel. How should we respond to that? How should our socio-political involvement look like? Because people that think the new covenant is fulfilled now, they want to install the Mosaic Law, they want to install penology, they want to have high expectations for the church and sanctification, but as we see, these are not necessarily true. And of course, we've given a sort of a recap and given steps on how to move forward with this complex issue. So here is a foreword by John Master. John Master is one of the people that is Israel only, as far as I know. And he wrote a foreword for the book, which I think is pretty good. In 1917, the Schofield Bible's comments on Hebrews chapter 8 spoke about the new covenant, but it suggested no form of present fulfillment. Basically, they sort of just said what the new covenant is, and they said it's for believers, and it's for Israel's restoration, and it's for blessings, and it's prophesied in German. That's all they said. They didn't say it was fulfilled with the church. They didn't say who is fulfilled with. They just said that. But then in 67, with the revised edition or the renewed edition, which most of the comments were not by Schofield originally, when it commented on Jeremiah 31, it highly suggests that it's presently fulfilled today with the church in some partial sense, partial fulfillment. What is a reader to do with such substantially distinct views? I mean, these are completely different views on the new covenant. Even Augustine and Jerome, which, by the way, both of them believe the church has replaced Israel. Both of these people have different views on the new covenant. See, you have Augustine and his sort of very allegorical view. He takes the new covenant, old covenant as different states before God. The old covenant, or the Adamic, which is sort of exemplified in the Mosaic covenant, that is the law. That is the state of unbelief before God. That is working for your salvation. But then the new covenant is belief in God, resting in Christ's finished work, and it's sort of an all-time thing. But then Jerome, I think, is in the right direction here. He's saying, no, those aren't two distinct states of God. They're two distinct time periods. You have the old covenant age with Israel. That's how they lived. They lived under the law as believers or unbelievers, but even believers had to keep the Mosaic Law. In the new covenant, no, you don't have to do that anymore. You're part of the church, and you're part of a new covenant, which has different Holy Spirit promises, right? So it's different degrees of sanctification. Now, again, I disagree with both of them in their fundamental assumption, but the people in this book that we're representing, they do not believe that. So, but you will see that sort of when they use the term fulfilled and stuff like that, like they use, oh, this is fulfilled here, this is partially fulfilled there, this is fulfilled in some sense here. They're using it in different ways, and they're not all using it in the same way, in the same sense, at the same time. So we have to sort of go over what they mean by that, and the different ways something can be fulfilled in the Bible. And so what does it mean for something to be fulfilled? Now, in the Bible, there's a few ways things can be fulfilled. And some of them have slight distinctions. Others are very much distinct. So actual fulfillment is what we usually think about. We think of it like this has come to pass, right? Something prophesied in the Old Testament, such as the birth of the Messiah in Bethlehem, in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6, Micah chapter 5, verse 2. The death of Jesus in Isaiah 53. These have a one-time singular fulfillment at a point in time, and they're never repeated again. Okay, this is it's like this will happen, and then this will happen, and it happens exactly as prophesied. So, or even Jesus riding on a donkey. That's another big one. So, This is actual fulfillment. But then there's something called partial fulfillment. Now, this is sort of it's a little bit different. So a prophecy has some parts of it fulfilled incompletely. So it's sort of like a foreshadowing. It's like, well, it's some parts are fulfilled, some are not. Some are waiting that full final fulfillment, that actual fulfillment at some time in the future, because this was sort of like a foreshadowing. People think of it like Matthew 24 and 70 AD, right? There's some similarities there, but obviously a lot of things didn't happen, right? The coming in the clouds of heaven, the stars being shaken, all of that stuff, the resurrection of the righteous, these things just didn't happen. So clearly, we're waiting that full fulfillment. Now, there's something called fulfillment in part, and it is a little different because it's not partial fulfillment in that a prophecy is sort of like incomplete. It's like, no, a prophecy is actually complete, but it only fulfills part of a passage, like half of it or something. This is a really good example in Isaiah chapter 61, verse 1 to 2, which is where Jesus says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to preach the gospel and to, say the grace of our Lord, or the year of our Lord, right? But then in the second part of it, it says, and to proclaim the vengeance of our God. The vengeance clearly has not happened yet, the judgment on the earth, but we're waiting that at the second coming of the Messiah. So that is a fulfillment in part. It fulfills part of the prophecy at one point, and then another point, another part is fulfilled. So progressive fulfillment is not either of those two, because it's sort of its actual fulfillment, but it is in stages, historical stages that the text recognizes. A good example of this is in Deuteronomy 28 to 29, talking about the history of Israel, where if you do this, you will be blessed. If you do this, you will be cursed. And Israel is, throughout her history, they're cursed and blessed in the same exact ways prophesied. They're led into captivity. They're speaking another language. They are the tail and not the head. And it sort of lists all of that. So that's a progressive fulfillment, because that doesn't really happen at a point in time. It's sort of over a span of stages. Typological fulfillment is a little different. This is sometimes what the New Testament means by fulfilled, like he fulfilled this, or this was fulfilled, or what was spoken as Hosea the prophet, right? This is not the fulfillment we think of. When Jewish mind thought of fulfillment, they usually thought of it in like type. They usually thought of it in like a pattern, where you have Jesus, for instance, he's called, out of Egypt I called my son, in Matthew 2 verse 15. But in reality, that was in context Hosea 11 talking about Israel. I mean, clearly there's no question about it. It says especially Israel, but sort of Matthew sees, okay, but Jesus is fulfilling typologically the purpose for Israel by embodying who Israel is, all of her identity, and thus becoming the faithful Israelite. You even see that in the temptation of the wilderness. So it's very interesting how they use that. And another one is not really a fulfillment, but it's an analogy. It's where you compare two events, historical events, whether in the future or past, and they're sort of like what's happening now, but it's not really the same. Such as the apostles in Acts 2 and the quote Joel chapter 2. Clearly, Joel chapter 2 was not fulfilled because Paul says the day of the Lord has not happened, right? So Joel 2 says it's the day of the Lord. 2 Thessalonians 2 says the day of the Lord has not happened. So clearly, it has to be just a comparison, not a fulfillment. And you'll see that as we go along. So one example of this that is pretty relevant to our study is Hebrews 8 verse 6. So Hebrews 8 verse 6, people think of as saying, this means that the new covenant has been enacted today, in terms of it's been fulfilled today in some sense. But the word enacted is not really, it's not really a good example of that. It's not really a good translation of that. So this word in the Greek it kind of fails to recognize the meaning of the Greek word, which is, I think, nomotheteu, it's something like that. And it's elsewhere. The only other time it's used is in Hebrews 7 verse 11, which actually means taught. So in Hebrews 7 verse 11, it says that through the Levitical priesthood, the people received the law. But the truth is, people did not receive the law in the Levitical priesthood. The Levitical priesthood was based on the law. So that doesn't logically make sense. really they were taught the law. They were shown and demonstrated the law through the teaching of the Levitical priesthood and the sacrifice for sins and the dedication to God required. So you see clearly that Jeremiah, when he is giving that new covenant prophecy, that he says, in that he says a new covenant, he made the first oath. So the moment God said there will be a new covenant with Israel, the moment God says this is the new, in those days I will make a new covenant. When he said that, that's when the old covenant became old and ready to wax away. It was already old before Jesus even died. Okay. And it never says it ended at the cross. It never says it ended at 70 AD because it's waiting to be done away with when the new covenant comes in at Jesus's return. In fact, if it did come in, right, and when Jesus died on the cross, then it can't be that the priests were offering things which were legitimate priests according to the law of Moses, right? And it can't be that Christ would have to respect that law, which says that he can't be a priest on earth, because it says if he can't be a priest on earth because the priests are offering things according to the law, right? So Jesus's priesthood on earth is incompatible with the Levitical priesthood. And additionally, just to support this, Christ's Melchizedekian priesthood is not fulfilled on earth today. Now, I'm going to qualify that it's not fulfilled on earth today. Obviously, there's a heavenly calling, but that's different. Technically, it's fulfilled when he recreates the earth after the 1,000-year millennial kingdom. And the reason is because the Aaronic Levitical priesthood and the Melchizedekian are mutually exclusive. Once there's a change in the priesthood, that means there's a doing away of the law, but we know the law is still in effect because they're doing things according to law. And even then, we see in Ezekiel 40 to 48, which we sort of briefly went over last time, that it will have real sacrifices with real Levitical Zadokian priests, right? And this must be fulfilled first before his Melchizedekian priesthood can fully commence. So he has heavenly calling in the tabernacle in God's presence, but it's not built with hands. So it's a little different. It's not a temple. So additionally, how do the authors of this book identify new covenant members? Now, as said before, Augustine saw no difference between the new covenant members of any age. He thought it was solely about regeneration, solely about salvation, forgiveness of sin. But Jerome saw that it was different areas of sanctification. He sort of how God deals with people and dispensations and stuff like that. And so, we try to be more careful in our language when we're discussing covenants and stuff, and we try to be more clear and concise, but we sort of have a tendency to lean toward that Jerome replacement side. For instance, you have Randall Gleason. I couldn't pull up his picture, but he actually compares the old covenant in 2 Corinthians 3:6 with a ministry of death. So he thinks that's talking about salvation. That's what he thinks it's talking about. Compared with the new covenant ministry of righteousness, which he obviously assumes is salvation, and it places believers in a superior position. So he's basically saying, look, we as the new covenant believers, we're in the New Testament, and we're part of the church, so we have that better righteousness. We have that better sanctification. Meanwhile, they had worse sanctification, right? They have it worse than us because they're not in the new covenant. But is that actually true? Is this actually true according to Paul? And are we actually in a better position in our sanctification than Israel? Well, this raises a few questions. So we have to compare the church versus Israel, just in terms of the time period and stuff like that. So what actually happened to the Israelites, if you can remember in Numbers and Exodus? Well, first, they were killed after making the golden calf. And so this is obviously in Exodus, I think, verse in around 30 to 32. They made the golden calf immediately after Moses went up to the mountain, and then they worshipped it. They thought it was God, and so God destroyed many of them. Many of them were killed, thousands. They were plagued after mumbling with the manna. So the manna came down from heaven. Jesus quotes that in John chapter 6. But then they mumbled about it. It's like, oh, what is this manna? Right? And then God gave them more food, and then they were plagued. They became sick because of their ungratefulness. They were consumed after Korah's rebellion. You see this you see this in Numbers chapter 16. This is right after the sin of the high hand, where if someone sins against God willfully, they will face retribution and death. And I think a few thousand were killed when Korah tried to rebel and take authority from Moses. You see that sort of earthquake thing happening there. And then many of them were bitten by serpents from Christ, which you see quoted in John chapter 3. It's talking about their physical death, right? They were physically killed by serpents because Christ sent them, which interestingly enough, I think sort of proves the deity of Christ, because it says the Lord sent serpents, but then it says that Christ sent serpents. So Paul is placing Christ in there, which is also another theological point, because we're not superior to them. The point is that we're not superior to them. They had the spiritual benefits. They had that spiritual rock. They had spiritual water. They had the baptism into Moses. See, we have baptism into Christ. They have baptism into Moses. It's still identification language. And yet they were killed. They even had Christ in their midst. See, a lot of people think, well, Christ, he's going to be much, better with us. We're not going to be like those people because we got Christ. Okay. Christ is different from that Old Testament stuff. Some people think that. But obviously, if Christ was there, if Christ was leading them, if Christ was the angel of the Lord leading them into victory, and we have Christ as well, we can't claim that we're, any free from the judgment as they were, right? They could still tempt God as well. And so we're capable of incurring the same discipline that Israel received. So how can we say in that case that we have some special new covenant ability that they didn't? We clearly don't. Maybe we have the Spirit, a little bit better sanctification, right? But not what the new covenant clearly details. So that's pretty obvious. So as we're going through this study, in the next few studies after, remember these 4 questions, right? You want to take notes on this? Get your notebook out. It's number 1 is, what is the Old Testament meaning of the text as the original audience would have understood them? Only use the Tanakh. Try only to use what the audience would have used when it was written hundreds of years before Christ, right? So hundreds of years before Christ. So always try to recognize that. Always try to use that as a hermeneutical basis. What does the original audience understand? And then from there, you can see what they could have understood, what they could have not. How is the term covenant being used? So the term covenant is obviously a contract between God and man, where one offers to do something for the other. Sometimes it can be bilateral. Sometimes it can be just unilateral. What does the author mean by fulfillment? One of the 6 definitions we posted up there, or 5. And what are the markers of someone living in the new covenant? What does the author think that the new covenant is? And what are the markers that someone is in the new covenant? So that's important to recognize. But before we get into that, before we get into all their papers, before we get into all their considerations, we must first ask the question, what exactly are the new covenant passages? We can't study what the new covenant is if we don't even know what the passages we're studying are. And this part of it was written by Dave Fredrickson. And in the introduction to the New Covenant, the last book we already did, we somewhat assumed what the passages of the New Covenant were. And we sort of went on deducing what the New Covenant was. We went over Jeremiah 31, 32, Ezekiel 36 and 37, Ezekiel 16, Joel chapter 2 even. But we sort of assumed that they were New Covenant. It doesn't say that. Like, it doesn't say in Ezekiel 36, the New Covenant. It doesn't say in Joel chapter 2, the New Covenant. It doesn't say in Hosea chapter 2, the New Covenant. It doesn't say these things, but we're sort of assuming that. But we sort of have to peel back our assumptions and say, okay, but what is the New Covenant passages, right? And this is important. So this is sort of, because this is backwards, right? Because we're sort of assuming what the New Covenant is and then discerning, right, what passages fit in it rather than the other way around. We have to get our understanding from the text, not imported into it. And so this conversation only comes up because of 1985, right? In 1985, the New International Version released a study Bible, which you see on the left here, where they actually said in the side comments about Isaiah chapter 42 and 49 that this is about the new covenant. So most people did not think that Isaiah had any passages about the new covenant in Isaiah chapter in the 40 to 55, right? Most people thought that, but in actuality, what they saw is that, but they what they thought is that, hey, this is a new covenant passage, and so they sort of got people thinking, okay, well, if this can be a new covenant passage in Isaiah chapter 42, what else could be a new covenant passage? And so they sort of questioned that. And so it was only assumed to be for Jeremiah and Ezekiel and all the prophets following it. But clearly, if we can find it in Isaiah, how far back could we find it? Could we find it in Daniel? Could we find it in Joel? Could we find it in anything else, right? And so this sort of spread a widespread analysis about what the new covenant is. Now, from this, we have a major player in the game. His name is called Walter Kaiser, and he is a well-known grammarian. He's a well-known hermeneutical giant, and he was the first evangelical to suggest in print at least 12 passages in the Old Testament about the new covenant, including Isaiah 42. And it even extends to 16 or 17 in some of his later reconsiderations. And this is sort of the seminal point. This is like in 1970s about the new covenant discussion in the Old Testament, and his model that we're going to get into. It's simple, it's effective, it gets the job done, but it's not perfect, right? One uncomfortable reality that we have to realize about Kaiser's model is that it has its foundations in a Catholic source, which is Stephen Portgrin. Now, of course, I know free graces are going to be like, oh, well, he's works-based, so he's not reliable. Well, that's not the reason why. The reason is because he's a high textual critic. So he thinks that Isaiah 1 to 39 is written by Isaiah, and then Isaiah chapter 40 to 55 is a post-exilic sort of text written by someone other than Isaiah. They're sort of pretending to be Isaiah. It's a pseudo-Isaiah, but they're not actually the original writer. That's sort of a high-tech critical assumption. Most evangelicals say no, Isaiah wrote the whole thing, and they're not illusions. They are actual prophecies about the new covenant. So this is sort of an assumption he has. I'm not a big fan of it. Most dispensationalists aren't, but that's his assumption. And so his criteria leaves much room for further progress, but it's still an excellent starting point. I think that Kaiser's starting point for discerning what the new covenant is actually pretty good. It's not the best. I'm not saying that everything about it is great, but it's pretty good. It's better than some of the other models we're going to see. So a few things before we get into them. Several models that I think it's around 5, right, have been proposed to understand which passages pertain to the new covenant. Oh, hold on a second. And we will look at several of them, and then hopefully we'll offer a final, hopefully better standard for evaluating potential new covenant passages. And these following models are from Walter Kaiser, Bruce Compton, John Master, which is one of the authors of this book, Larry Pettigrew, and Pierre Buis. And he would obviously be French, so he comes from a different textual tradition. And they will contain the major criteria on one side, so criteria, critique, as well as potential critique for it if necessary. Now, not all of them I critique as heavily. Some I critique more than others, but I think there is some critique for it and some praise for each one. So hold on a second. Okay. So the criteria. I'm just going to list them here. He has 4 criteria. Kaiser's 4 criteria are, number 1, the covenant is called an eternal covenant. Now, he's just talking about the phrase itself. So he's very phraseology focused. He's very word focused. And he's just focusing on the words. Is it called an eternal covenant? Is it called a covenant of peace? Is it labeled my covenant or a covenant in that day? In that day is sort of an eschatological thing. And does it have the phrase new heart and new spirit? Now, he's sort of getting with something here in that last one. But, and he only gets that from Ezekiel 36. But, so number 1, the first criteria, eternal covenant. This is sort of lackluster. It's not bad, right? Like if you talk about internal covenant, it's like, okay, why isn't that the new covenant? Jeremiah 32 labels that as a new covenant. And that's true, right? Jeremiah 32, the eternal covenant is the new covenant, but that doesn't mean eternal covenant equals new covenant every time it's used. That's sort of an equivocation fallacy. A good example of this is apples are fruit, and oranges are fruit. Therefore, apples equals oranges, right? It's sort of like, wait, hold on. Just because they have one thing in common doesn't mean they're the same thing. So yes, the new covenant is eternal covenant, but this also applies to the Abrahamic covenant, the Davidic covenant, and the Noahic covenant, which most people forget is eternal. God will never flood the earth again to destroy it. Right now, of course, he'll destroy it in other ways with fire, but not with a flood. And in fact, two of these are explicitly eschatological, the Abrahamic and the Davidic, according to Isaiah 55, verse 3, and Isaiah 61, verse 8. Right? It's in the end times. So it's not just the new covenant. And so the covenant of peace. Now, technically, this is not found in Jeremiah 31. I could see how someone could make that connection. It's like, okay, Jeremiah 31, forgiveness of sins. Forgiveness of sins provides peace. So it's like a covenant of peace. I could see that connection. But again, it's too broad. You see that same phrase is found in Isaiah 54, talking about the Noahic covenant. It's explicitly called a covenant of peace that people have broken. And the new covenant cannot be broken, obviously. And it's sort of a subset of blessings within the broader covenant. So just because it mentions peace doesn't mean that that's like the intrinsic only thing to the new covenant, because Hosea 2 is talking about a covenant with Israel and the wilderness. Right? It's like, okay, well, that's with the wilderness. Does that mean there's a separate covenant for the land animals that they sort of kind of course not. Right? That's just an aspect of those blessings of the new covenant. Another one is called My Covenant, or A Covenant Within That Day. This, again, it sort of tries to be eschatological, but it's, again, this is too broad, right? This refers to 3 eschatological covenants, and it sort of assumes the new covenant is the only one to be fulfilled at the eschaton, because a lot of people think the Davidic is fulfilled and the Abrahamic gets fulfilled in the church, which I don't agree with. And the last one is the phrase new heart and the new spirit. And this one is actually an opposite problem. So the other 3 were too vague and general. This one is too specific, because the problem with Kaiser's model is what he tried to do is he tried to say, okay, it has the phrase new heart and new spirit. I'm only going to look for that phrase. But you only see that in 4 Ezekiel passages. I think Ezekiel 36, 16, 18, 31, and 11. Ezekiel 11. So it's just too specific. If you focused on the conceptual link rather than the phraseological link, I think it could work. But unfortunately, it's and it would include Joel chapter 2, which many models fail to do, but it just doesn't. So I think that's sort of a flaw in using this criteria. Now, the second one is the Compton method. Now, the 4 criteria mentioned are that a covenant is explicitly named. And this is sort of leaning to the eschatological aspect. It's sort of like, okay, what is eschatological about it? What can we use to deduce that's going to happen in the future? Because he thinks of it as very future oriented. And so he says a covenant is mentioned. So that's pretty fair, right? It's vague, but okay, I can see where you're going with this. A covenant is mentioned, and therefore it's about the new covenant, or it can be about the new covenant. It's a candidate for it. But this is also again, I think it's actually too vague and too specific, because you can have a new covenant text that is about the blessing of the new covenant, but it doesn't explicitly mention the phrase berith or covenant. So that's sort of a flaw in that aspect. The covenant is future and eschatological. Again, it's like the phrase in that day. There's a lot of covenants with Yahweh that are eschatologically focused. And it sort of makes it very difficult for God to describe any eschatological thing that's going to happen without it being appropriated into new covenant. Like it talks about the Gentiles being given salvation to the end of the earth. People think, yeah, that's an eschatological thing in the kingdom. That doesn't mean that it's the new covenant. So it's sort of like, that would mean that God has a very difficult time to describe things in the future without them being explicitly new covenant. Israel faces judgment and dispersion. This one, I'm not sure to think about that. I mean, there's literally hundreds upon hundreds of passages, even in the New Testament, that are explicitly about the judgment and dispersion of Israel. I mean, there's entire books dedicated to it. It's just a major thing, and it's just not like it's not just the new covenant. It just can't. But then afterward, Israel is restored to her homeland. This one is sort of different because I can understand where he's coming from, but I don't consider this a result of the new covenant. I consider this a historical prerequisite of the new covenant, as in like this must happen first before the new covenant is in play. Like that makes sense, but it's not a result of the new covenant. The result of the new covenant is other things, but in order to get the new covenant, they need to be in their land, just like Israel being led out of Egypt to be ready for the old covenant as Sinai. Now, fifth one, Israel experiences great material and spiritual blessings, right? This one, there's a lot of blessings. I mean, it's too generic. Material and spiritual, they don't make that distinction there. You can have material blessings as one part, spiritual blessings as another part. You can sort of differentiate the two. This one seems too general. It can apply to literally any covenant in Scripture. But I think that the fatal flaw in the Compton method that I've seen from the authors is that additional criteria are being given with each new book added. So when they evaluate Isaiah, there's additional criteria. When they evaluate Ezekiel, there's different criteria. When they evaluate other passages, there's new criteria, right? And so you end up with like 20 different criteria that could fit any passage. And it's sort of a fatal flaw because you never know what is the new covenant. If you're always expanding what the criteria is, you'll never know what the new covenant is. I mean, you'll just assume any passage is a new covenant passage, right? It can always get larger. So that's a pretty fatal flaw. I can see what they're doing here, but that last part of it is pretty crucial, and I think it sort of messes the whole thing up. Now, the third one is, in my opinion, personally not my favorite. It is from a single Israel only dispensationalist. I do appreciate that, but I think his hermeneutics are too conservative. Like they're very limiting, and you'll see why. So he mentions explicitly the term new covenant. So one of his criteria is that it has to mention the phrase in the Old Testament as new covenant. The problem for this is, number one, there is no other text in the Old Testament that say the phrase new covenant. If it did, we know about it. There's only one text, which means that he uses Jeremiah 31 as the single and only primary passage regarding the new covenant. But the problem is there's actually no justification that Master gives other than the name. But that's a problem because because something can have the term covenant and be about the Abrahamic covenant, even though it doesn't explicitly say Abrahamic covenant, even though it doesn't explicitly say Davidic or Noahic covenant, right? It doesn't have to explicitly say that. So just because it doesn't say the term new covenant doesn't necessarily mean it's not the new covenant. You have to evaluate it on its own basis, right? So there's no justification for this. It's very inconsistent. And so he identifies two primary elements for the new covenant. I think there's more, but his two primary elements are the replacing the Mosaic covenant, again, found only in Jeremiah 31, and to be obedient to God's commands through unilateral divine change. I think one of the major critiques I have for this is that he places too much emphasis on the results of the transformation rather than the transformation itself. And you can risk excluding otherwise perfectly reasonable new covenant candidates, right? Like there's a lot of text in the Old Testament just about Israel's spiritual transformation, but they don't mention her obedience. They don't mention her life. They don't mention her anything after that. It's just about the transformation, the spiritual transformation itself. And that's a perfectly fine new covenant addition, right? But he would sort of limit it too much that I don't think it's justified. A third one is the ministry of the Holy Spirit. I think this is a genuinely good one. I think this is genuinely good, a good addition. I do like this is a major thing. And this is overlooked by most commentators. And it creates a real distinction between the new covenant and the other covenants, right? But again, it sort of goes against some criteria because this phrase, Holy Spirit, is never found in Jeremiah 31. The phrase, the term Holy Spirit, I can agree the concept is there, like in your heart and your mind, and I wrote my law in your mind. Like, I can see how you can get that. But if you're going to be strict about it, you can't get it from Jeremiah 31. And his fourth criteria is not a criteria, but he uses Ezekiel 36 as an intermediate passage to sort of help determine what's a new covenant passage. Now this again sounds good. Jeremiah 31, Ezekiel 36, right? You got two texts, combine them together, and you have a pretty good combination. But the problem is this sort of shows how limiting the method is, which is why I would not recommend it, because it's sort of untenable. The only justification that Master uses for going to Ezekiel 36 in his paper is that he just says, oh, well, everyone believe it. It's universally recognized. Everyone knows the New Covenant text. But this is extra biblical at best and contradictory at worst. Because you're saying, I'm just using Jeremiah 31. I'm just using Jeremiah 31. And then you're like, oh, but Ezekiel 36 I can use because everyone knows it. Well, who cares what everyone knows? It's completely irrelevant if you're doing serious exegesis, in my opinion. So I think this is a very limiting method. The fourth method is the Pettigrew method. Now, the criteria he mentions, or the elements of the new covenant, is new, right? It's the idea of a covenant that is cut at a future point in time, a new covenant, not a covenant already in place. So I do appreciate that. Now, this helps. It keeps the covenant distinct. It's designed to be enacted at a future point, which is what the new covenant is. So it's not the Abrahamic and Davidic. But again, there's just only one passage that uses this phrase. Only one passage that uses the phrase new covenant. And other than that, it is very difficult to determine otherwise. And so unlike the Mosaic covenant, it's everlasting and irrevocable. Which again, this is true. And this is just like Kaiser said, it's an eternal covenant. It is an unending covenant. And this is great and all, but it's just too generic. It's too generic to use. Just because in fact, it doesn't even have to say the term everlasting for it to be everlasting, right? So that again doesn't work. And it also just not many passages in the Old Testament contrast the old and the new, right? Yeah, there's some that sort of hint at it, but ultimately there's not many that sort of say I'm going to replace the Mosaic covenant. They never would have imagined that. If it offers an abundance of physical blessings, and so yes, it is generic. I'm not just going to say that, but I do appreciate this is my sort of not criticism, but sort of praise about it. I like how it sort of makes the distinction between the spiritual and the physical blessings. The physical blessings are one thing. They're what God gives to Israel just because they're Israel. And so it sort of keeps that distinct, the land promises, and that zoological benefits from the spiritual transformation. So it sort of keeps that distinct. They're tied, but they are distinct. A fourth one is that it offers spiritual provisions, which it explicitly lists them as the internal transformation, the divine forgiveness, the consummated covenantal relationship, not just positional, but covenantal. And so this is like Master's list, but it's with less inconsistency. It recognizes the key element of the new covenant as the Spirit of Yahweh, which we'll get into later. And it's and what I like about this method is that it actually introduced me to a new covenant passage I never knew, which was Jeremiah 24, talking about a new heart and a new way, and Isaiah 44 talking about the Spirit of Yahweh upon Israel. So I think this is actually a good way to distinct it. And I don't really have any critique for that. So it's just a genuinely good understanding. However, but I will say this is from his earlier edition. His later edition that he uses, he also included passages like in Isaiah about the mediatorial Messiah King, the mediator of the new covenant, like in Isaiah 59 and other places. But my problem with this is that if you just use this as a criteria, you'll end up using a bunch of passages about Jesus' first coming, and you'll assume that they're about the new covenant when they could be about the Davidic covenant. They don't have to be about the new covenant. They could be about the Davidic covenant, about the Abrahamic covenant, which he's also mediator of, right? He's a mediator of many covenants. So just because Jesus is the mediator of something doesn't mean that it's just about the new covenant. So that's not my favorite, and it sort of conflates the two too much. The Buist method, which we're going to look at last, is 6 things. Well, technically 5, but there's a 6. The gathering and return of the people of Israel. This sort of focuses again on the eschatological aspect, which we already said was a prerequisite, not a result of it. So I think it sort of risks that. The definition of the covenant, he sort of assumes that it's a definition of it, which is that they will be my people, I will be their God, that covenantal fellowship. But this is limiting, right? It's helpful, don't get me wrong, but this is pretty limiting. There are very few passages in the Old Testament that says they will be my people and I will be their God. There's a few, right? But there's not a lot. It's pretty limiting, and it's not broad enough. Like, there's broad and then there's too broad. And so there's also, and again, there's also another aspect of this is that the defining element of the new covenant isn't just that they will be my people, but they will unconditionally be so. Like, they will eternally be so. And so it's unconditional. He does not assume it's unconditional, right? Because I think he's a Catholic or whatever, but he's high critic, but he assumes it's conditional, right? Which is a major problem. The people's internal renovation, which he doesn't really focus on the spiritual aspect of it, right? That it does involve Yahweh's spirit, right? And yes, it is internal, but how is it internal? That's my major critique. So he doesn't really declare how it's accomplished. The declaration as a final covenant. Now, he doesn't like the term everlasting and eternal, like the words olam. He likes the idea of final covenant, the last covenant. But again, it's just not true that the new covenant is the final covenant, right? The covenant to end all covenant. It doesn't end all covenant. It fulfills all covenants. It leads to the fulfillment of the covenants. The Davidic, where Jesus reigns over Israel, the Abrahamic, blessing the world and stuff like that. The new covenant fulfills those things, but it's not like some final covenant that outdoes all the other ones, and it's sort of compacted into it. I don't agree with that. The covenant blessings, that's just what he says. It's just generic, right? Again, there's a lot. And second of all, there's blessings that God gives even without a covenant. God doesn't need a covenant to mediate blessings. He could just give it just because. He could just give it because he's God, right? He doesn't need a covenant for everlasting life, for instance. He could, but that's just not what he does. And I think another fatal flaw with this is that he doesn't include Deuteronomy 30 and Isaiah 40 to 55 in his evaluation because he thinks they are post-exilic. This is the same problem we had with the Kaiser's foundation. That guy, Stefan, I think it's a really bad flaw for evangelicals. I think that this is unfortunate for dispensational premillennialists. So I don't think you should be assuming that Isaiah 40 is a different author. I think that's very, very misguided. So what else? Now, a summary of the models. So just giving a quick summary of the models we just looked at. We saw with the Kaiser model that it was quick. It's flexible. It's simple. You could sort of mix and match different phrases here and there, but it's not refined. It's not advanced enough. We need to be expanded and enhanced, and it leads to a lot of conflations. So not a fan. We saw with the Compton model. Yes, it wanted to leave no stone unturned. It wanted to include all that you can, all the possible passages that you can include about the new covenant. But it sort of became untenable because you could never actually capture every new covenant passage. You could always have another new covenant passage, right? Which I don't think is very helpful. We saw with the master model that it was very exegetically conservative. So you'll know exactly what's a new covenant passage, but you'll never know all the new covenant passages. And you'll end up leaving a lot, and you'll end up being inconsistent in your own model that, for revisions to it. So it's just not possible. We saw with the Pettigrew model that it sort of tried to build upon the masters with the eschatological focus, with the spiritual blessings, with the phraseology. But the later rendition, I felt, led to conflation with the Davidic covenant. That's a second edition. Not a big fan of that because the Davidic and the new covenant are clearly not the same. And we saw with the Buist model that it assumes fatally a higher critical framework that ends up excluding much of Isaiah, even if, it is helpful. It does include also the deuterocanonical books. I don't believe they're true, but they include like Baruch 24, right? And other patterns, Second Ezra, 45%, like, or Second Ezra, sorry. And sort of like, okay, yeah, I can see that you're including that, but I don't believe those books are actually true. So, and you're a high texture critic, so I'm just not a fan. But we need something fresh. We need something new, right? Just like the text says, we need to be out with the old and in with the new. And I ain't talking about covenants. I'm talking about models. So we need to build a 3-step plan for evaluating a model that tells us exactly what is a new covenant passage, right? Now, our first step is we have to have some idea about what the new covenant is. I know I said before that we have to know what the passages are, but the truth is you have to understand, at least like from basic elements, like from the New Testament, for instance, what the new covenant even is. If Jesus says this is the blood of the new covenant, we have to say, okay, what would they have thought about the new covenant? What did they think was the new covenant? Yeah, they're thinking about Jeremiah 31, but not just Jeremiah 31, you know? So we have to have some idea about what the new covenant is, at least in a bare bones analysis, right, of what it can be. And secondly, this is another key one. We have to make sure that Jeremiah 31 is not the definitional new covenant passage. Number one, because it's not the first one we're going to look at chronologically. There have been other new covenant passages before. And then second of all, because this sort of makes it the new covenant passage, that the one might mistakenly assume that factors in this passage are premier new covenant factors in other rather than a broader element. So you might assume that a passage in the Old Testament, right, is a premier new covenant feature. It's only exclusive to the new covenant. But then you realize later on, well, this is just an aspect of the blessings of it. This is not like the full thing. This is not like the definition of it. Okay? And secondly, you might make a passage a primary new covenant passage because it might not contain all the elements, right? So just because it's the truth is Jeremiah 31 does not contain every single new covenant element. It just doesn't. It never says it's an everlasting covenant. It never mentions explicitly the Spirit. It never mentions a lot of the things we associate with the new covenant. And yet, it never mentions obedience. And yet, it's a definition of new covenant passage. It's a primary passage. And I'm not saying it shouldn't be a primary passage. I'm just saying not just Jeremiah 31, right? You can use others. I think that's the flaw most have. And so, third of all, after we've done these two, we need to constantly reassess our verification process, right? We need to constantly assess, right? What we're determining as secondary passages, what's a primary passage, and vice versa, right? We can't just assume that we're right. We have to constantly, just like the reformer said, semper reformanda, right? Always reforming and getting from the biblical data. So from this model, I'm not going to go through every passage, but from this model, we can deduce that there are 6 features of the new covenant, which is number 1, it's a future divine covenant with Israel specifically, not textually linked with Abraham or David. This is important, right? If it says the covenant I gave to Abraham or the land I gave to their fathers, right? We know that that's not explicitly just about the new covenant. We know that that's possibly only the Abrahamic. We know the mercies of David, that's the Davidic covenant, right? But that's not the new covenant. The Spirit of Yahweh as an agent. This is a key factor. Other Old Testament texts, they don't deal with they don't deal with the Spirit of Yahweh as the agent. But then God says, I will give them a new heart. I will give them a new spirit. So the Spirit of Yahweh is explicitly an agent. The internal spiritual transformation of the Israelites, again, in contrast to the Mosaic, which was outward reformation, but now there's going to be inward reformation in the inward man. Okay. And fourth, the uninterrupted permanence of blessings. So not just blessings in a general sense, but blessings that will flow forever because of that unconditional nature, which again makes it permanent. Yes, it's everlasting, but not just the covenant itself, but the blessings associated. They're never going to end for the nation of Israel. And again, the fifth one and the sixth one are sort of again the sort of compacted into the regathering Israel. That's an element that is a prerequisite, not a result of the new covenant, as well as the restoration of Israel. That's sort of a generic term that sort of sees all the covenants fulfilled. So these six elements, I think 1, 2, 3, and 4 are the explicit ones that are solely about the new covenant, and I think 5 and 6 are more elements associated with it that can be for any covenant. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen this meme, but it's called new like stonks. Well, guess what? We got the new covenant stonks are going up. So you got to invest right now because it might get too expensive. It might be Bitcoin in the future. Who knows? but one of the benefits of this model is that it differentiates between new covenant factors that describe it versus distinguish it from other covenants. So that's important, right? Because we have to remember that just because something is descriptive of the new covenant, like eternal, everlasting, peace, the restoration of Israel, blessings, these are generic statements about any covenant, literally any covenant. Every covenant is meant to have blessing, right? But that doesn't mean it's a distinguishing factor. Just because just because it describes it doesn't mean it distinguishes it. You know, you can use this for anything. Like the Son is God, but that doesn't distinguish it from the Father. The Son is the Son because he's begotten of the Father, right? That's just one example. However, some features of the new covenant are exclusive only to the new covenant, like the Spirit of Yahweh, the transformation of Israel, the replacing of the old covenant, the final forgiveness of sins. A big part of the new covenant, it's not the only part, but it's a major part of it, is that forgiveness of sins that is everlasting, right? They're never going to be taken out of the land. They're never going to be disciplined in that, again, national sense, okay, during the millennium. And then one bonus of this is that most previous models never considered Isaiah 59 to be a primary new covenant text. But in this passage, we see not only we have the Spirit of Yahweh, it talks about, their words will not depart from them. It's unending blessings. It transforms Israel. It's the second coming of the Messiah. And again, Paul links it with Isaiah 27, which is about, I will take away the sins of Israel. So this is about the forgiveness of sins. And so it's sort of all of these features about the new covenant, as well as the salvation of Israel. He comes to save in verse 15. So this is a major new covenant passage that people overlook oftentimes, but hopefully we could get more into it. Now, some New Testament outcomes from this. So yes, we went over the Old Testament. What about the New Testament? According to dispensational hermeneutics, the New Testament never changes the meaning of the Old Testament. It can maybe give greater insight to it. It can build upon it, but it never changes the meaning. It never gives a meaning that nobody would have ever come up with, right? Because otherwise, if you can't change the meaning of something if you're using it as an argument. That doesn't make sense. We find in the New Testament that there's striking similarity with the constituent elements with the Old Testament, right? So the New Testament never redefines the Old Covenant. The New Covenant. It never defines it as something other than what the readers would have thought. It never quotes it haphazardly, right? It explicitly it quotes it in Hebrews 8 in full, the Jeremiah 31 passage. In Romans 11, it emphasizes the future salvation of Israel. In 2 Corinthians 3 all the way to 6, it talks about the ministry, right, of Paul, sort of looking like the new covenant or being akin to it. And that's the spiritual nature of it, right? Revelation 7 talks about the physical regathering of the new covenant people, the under 44,000 Jews in the millennial kingdom. The only difference about the new covenant is that we explicitly know now that the mediator of these blessings is Jesus, the Messiah, the Christ. That's the only thing that is new. Other than that, nothing changes. Nothing about the new covenant changes. Okay, in terms of what we know about it. And so the basic conclusion we have after all of this is that this was our first and probably the longest part to our second series going over the new covenant. The rest will be a lot shorter because the the essays are a lot shorter. The models we found to figure out what the new covenant is and what passages fit in it were helpful. Pettigrew, Kaiser, Buis, they were helpful, but ultimately they were lacking, right? They either were too restrictive, too general, too broad, too flexible, and too critical. And so we sort of tried to find that middle ground with that dispensational lens and find one that rests upon the real objectivity and it's self-corrective. You always want to find a falsifiable, self-corrective method. Now, the biggest hurdle of it, in my opinion, is that it sort of lacks clarification on what's a primary passage and what's a secondary passage. Something you thought was primary could end up being secondary and vice versa. So you'll never really know, but that's sort of the beauty of it because it's always being reformed. This series should go faster than the previous series, since we won't have to review what we repeated before. We won't have to review everything about the new covenant, the timing of it, the other covenants, the church. We don't have to do all of that because we've already gone through that, right? You have already seen the last series, hopefully. And if you haven't, I recommend going over through it, right? So we won't have to go over that. It's sort of like if you're in a calculus class, they're not going to teach you basic arithmetic. Like, dude, you already know the basics. I'm not giving you introduction again. However, this one will be more focused on debates, advanced theology, stuff like that. So just be prepared for that. So the only thing I have left to ask is, are there any questions? The answer is no, because it was perfect. It was absolutely perfect. So just some questions. Right? Islam is better than dispensationalism. But it showed I already answered that. Everything but single covenant Israel only is mushy cope, right? Wait, hold on. Wait, hold on. Hopefully you can hear me. Right, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's cope, dude. And in my opinion, I think that even the indirect view, and again, I respect views that try to keep Israel, especially when I talked to Charles about it, or Quad and I talked to Charles about it. Hopefully we can even do streams with Quad where we talk about this stuff and we discuss the new covenant. So that would be really interesting to see. Harassing and threatening the host is not allowed. Dude, are you? Yeah, dude, is bro okay? It's like, I'm going to come over to New Jersey, which, yeah, I've said I live in New Jersey. You don't know where, though. I'm not going to tell you where, right? It's not that specific. I can say where I was born. I was born in New York, but it's like coming. Oh, I'm going to come over to New Jersey. I'm like, what? Okay, you're good, dude. Yeah, search this giant city. I'm probably in a place nobody even knows about. But yeah, that's just completely not allowed. So, what is it? You know what's sad though? Yeah, that's really sad. Like we have Haruzen, and then there's true Haruzen. So the last one was fake Haruzen, and now we have true Haruzen. Okay, and he goes, "Why do people do that, dude? Like, do people have nothing?" By the way, he came in on different accounts to try and debate, and like, it's like, why, dude? Like, just get a life, touch some grass, bro. If you got banned, you got banned. Don't be mad about it. I don't have another account. I don't have a second YouTube account. I don't have a second account I go on and try to, debate people on it. That's pathetic, in my opinion. Like, just use the one account you have. What, are you scared? In my opinion, are you scared? Respect there to the NIV. Yeah, I'm not saying I like the NIV. I'm not saying I like the NIV. Trolls keep coming back under different aliases. Yeah. Well, good that you got rid of it. I don't really care too much, but it's bad for the stream. So there's consequences for there's consequences for certain actions, right? Yeah, I mean, yeah, consequences for certain actions. Yeah, like these actions, you get into a channel, you get timed out. I don't know. If people just want to watch this just because they want to troll, fine. But if you actually want to learn something about theology and eschatology, then maybe you can watch me. You could probably watch someone better, and it'll be better. I might not agree with PB, but threatening violence is not Christian behavior, right? What is it? Yeah, I mean, you can not agree with me. That's perfectly fine. You don't have to agree with me. You could disagree with me. There are people in my own camp that disagree with me on a lot of things. There's people that are calling me a heretic. People are saying I give a non-saving gospel. Okay? Hey, I mean, I can't control that, but at least don't threaten me. That would be very nice. So, TBS is cooked. TBS is cooked is hilarious though. I kind of like that. Jesus tells me to love my neighbor, not tear them down. Exactly. John 1:17, right? Well, yeah, John 1:17, it says grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. I'm actually not sure exactly what you're highlighting there, but that is a great verse about the truth that comes through Jesus Christ compared to the Mosaic law, the different standards, different living there. Hold on. Yeah, so but Charles is coming in soon. When he comes in, he should be able to shut down the stream. Right now, if anyone has any questions about it, I don't know if there's anyone there, but if there's any questions about the new covenant, right, specifically, or the Abrahamic, that would be great. But otherwise, I could go back and explain things I didn't explain before. So what else? Yeah, Revelation 7, the New Testament, this is really interesting. The New Testament, a lot of people think sort of overrides the Old Testament that we looked into in the previous study. We're not going to really go into all that stuff here, but it's very interesting to see that when you look at how the New Covenant, when you look at the New Covenant passages, when you look at Romans 11, when you look at 2 Corinthians 3, when you look at the Lord's Supper, it never says anything the Old Testament doesn't say. It never says that. We know that Hebrews 9 is the mediator of the new covenant, right? Or Hebrews 9:15 explicitly says Jesus is the mediator of the new covenant through his death on the cross. We know that's true, absolutely. And so we know Jesus is the mediator of the new covenant. And sort of we know that the new covenant is sort of on hold until the church ends. Romans chapter 11, it's very clear. But never does it say anything new that we would not get from the Old Testament. And so I think when people have that assumption, right? I think the other thing we see is that in the Old Testament, could you theoretically theorize that the Messiah was going to die on the cross or die substitutionarily to mediate the new covenant? Maybe. I mean, I think that would have been a stretch, but definitely we know that you could believe, not saying everyone did, but you could believe that the Messiah in Psalms chapter 110 is the Melchizedekian priest, right? And so sort of a question arises, okay, if he's a priest, according to the Melchizedek, that means that he offers sacrifices, but what sacrifices is he offering, right? And so you could question that. You see Isaiah 53, it talks about the sacrifice of himself. And so, okay, if that's the Messiah and the Messiah is a priest and he offers sacrifices, that means he offered himself as a sacrifice, right? But then that's for sort of and if the Messiah also comes as a sacrifice and they pierced him, Zechariah 12, right? I mean, and he comes to bring that new covenant. You can sort of see the connection there in, with Isaiah 59. I'm not saying it's crystal clear. Definitely there's things that you wouldn't know as clearly as you would in the New Testament. Obviously, you don't have that explicit connection made, but it's not impossible. Like I obviously the New Testament authors, they saw something in the Old Testament that they didn't see before, and so it's not impossible. It's just it would have been very difficult, but we now know with the revelation connecting everything that no, Jesus is the mediator of the covenant through his death and resurrection. Jesus is the one who installs it with Israel. Jesus is the one who gathers the nations in Isaiah 49, the suffering servant, after his resurrection. We know all these things now. And so that's sort of the only difference with the New Testament that I find. So another one to explain is this idea of forgiveness. Forgiveness is sort of like, people ask, okay, is it an aspect of the new covenant, or is it what it allows it to be put in place? I think it's sort of it's sort of a both and. Like, I think that the forgiveness is clearly an aspect of the covenant, but it's sort of like it's what allows it to function. Just like forgiveness is what allows fellowship to take place. Okay, it's sort of an aspect and the part of the functionality of it. So they're not really separable in that sense. And so Jeremiah 31, but what's interesting about Jeremiah 31 is it never mentions a sacrifice. It never mentions a sacrifice. And yet clearly we know that there had to be a sacrifice for sin. So how is God going to provide this forgiveness? Well, you could sort of see the connection there. Okay. And restoration of Israel, I think that's very generic. Even the Abrahamic covenant guarantees that. It guarantees it'll always be a nation. So just because it'll always be a nation and it'll be gathered doesn't mean you have to assume it's a new covenant passage. We identified the 6 factors. I think that was pretty clear. I sort of went briefly over this one, but people assume that factors in this passage are premier new covenant factors in others rather than the broader element. So I sort of explained, okay, some people think that because a passage is about the new covenant and it also mentions these other things, like maybe Hosea 22 or something else like that, and talks about the zoological stuff, or Isaiah 11 talking about the blessing to the whole world, or Psalm chapter 78, that, okay, therefore that's just strictly the new covenant, that's definitional to it, right? And then you can see how that transfers over to New Testament stuff. But that's not necessarily true. Something can be just a generic aspect about it, a factor in it, but it's sort of part of a broader element, right? The blessings of the animals are a broader element of the new covenant blessings associated with the Torah rather than the definitional new covenant aspect. And sort of that also goes with the assumption that Jeremiah 31 is the only new covenant primary passage, right? And that, in my opinion, is not a good assumption. There can be other primary passages, as we've seen, Ezekiel 36, Isaiah 59, right? In my opinion, I didn't articulate this, but I don't think Isaiah 42, in its context, is a new covenant text. I know a lot of people think it is. People think that it's a new covenant text. People think Isaiah 42, I will give you as a covenant to the people, that is about the new covenant. It never says that because we know the new covenant is for Israel, right? Jeremiah 31 and Isaiah 59 makes that clear. It's to Israel. And so this covenant, or sort of promise, you can articulate it, is basically something God also promises. He says it's a light thing. It's not enough for you to regather the dispersed of Israel. I will also give you as a light to the people, right? To be the salvation to the ends of the earth. Okay, so that is another thing on top of what he's going to do with Israel that is part of this covenant or this promise that he makes with the people. And again, Jesus is not the covenant. Jesus is the mediator of the covenant. He can't be both the mediator and the covenant itself. I know that Charles talked about this in his debate, but that's just a logical contradiction. You can be the source of the covenant, like it says God is your reward, but it doesn't mean he's literally your reward. It's a metonymy, right? So that's important to remember. And so I also said that we have to have initial premises. I mean, yeah, this mostly comes from the New Testament. It says a new covenant. It says it multiple times. It says new covenant in the New Testament more times than in the Old Testament, which sort of gives you an idea of how important, of like what it might be. And so we have to sort of evaluate what it is. But just because it's mentioned in the New Testament doesn't mean it's being fulfilled in the New Testament. It can be talking about it without explicitly saying it's fulfilled, right? In terms of just like the resurrection or the kingdom or the new heaven and new earth. You could talk about these things like Isaiah 65. That doesn't mean that they're fulfilled, right? We did the summary of the models. I didn't like the Pettigrew model. I didn't have a problem with it. I think most of it was pretty good. I think it's just a major problem with most of the models is that it ends up using Jeremiah 31 too much, and it ends up not being reevaluated, and when it is, it ends up being too broad. Another one is Deuteronomy 30. A lot of people were lost on this one. I had to include this. This was a long one, but I had to include it because it was very important for understanding what we're working with. Kaiser is a major one. Compton is a major one. Right? I mean, you would suspect that I would like the Compton model. I actually don't. I think, again, my favorite is probably the Pettigrew early rendition of it. I think Buiss's is too high critical. He uses the deuterocanonical, but the Compton method I'm not a fan of. Yes, it is eschatological, but that's not just like the only aspect of it. Like the only reason it's eschatological is because Israel is still out of her land, right? There's still events that have to take place and the tribulation and stuff like that. But, you shouldn't just use eschatology to define the new covenant. I think that's it's a bit of a stretch. And 12 passages. I think 12 passages is good. Like, I think 12 to 16 passages. I think, like, the passages that were definitely mentioned, right, were definitely mentioned by the author were, what is it? It's like Deuteronomy 30 is like one of the earliest hints of it, right? Deuteronomy 30 with the circumcision of the heart, which is sort of parallel to new heart and new spirit. Joel chapter 2 is another really early one. Isaiah chapter 44, in my opinion, I think is an actual, probably a new covenant passage. Isaiah 59, again, is a clear new covenant passage. Even Jeremiah 24 is another good one. Jeremiah 30 to 33 is full of a lot of promises to Israel. What else you see? I think that probably Ezekiel 11, Ezekiel 16, 36, 18, and 37. Those are all major new covenant passages that you can use to evaluate. I don't think Hosea 2 is explicitly new covenant. I think that's generic blessings for restoration of Israel. Zechariah 12 even talks about the Spirit of God poured out on the inhabitants of Israel. You see that again in other passages about God's Spirit being poured out, right? God's Spirit being in the midst of them. So there's a lot of flexibility once you include the Spirit of God in the end time specifically. You get a lot of passages there, right? But hold on. Hold on, because it is taking a while. So, and again, I just don't assume that Isaiah 40 to 55 is a different author. I again, and the reason I don't is mostly because obviously I think it's inspired, but I think a lot of the reason people think that it is a different author is because it's sort of a backwards assumption. They're sort of assuming, oh, miracles can't be true. Miracles can't be the case. And so it has to be a different author. That's why people think Deuteronomy 28 to 30 is a different author, because they think, oh, well, this Moses didn't write it clearly because it's too specific to Israel's history. It can't be prophecy. So they're already coming from the assumption that there can't be prophecy, and sort of they're going back, and so it becomes unfalsifiable. If you've already assumed that nothing can falsify your system, right, then you sort of go against any evidence that does falsify your system. And so I think that's a major assumption. Like in Isaiah 44, it talks about, right? Oh, Charles is a block away. Yeah, in Isaiah chapter 44, right? I think it talks about Cyrus. And people say, oh, well, yes, it's Cyrus. It mentions him by name explicitly, the Assyrian king. It mentions him explicitly by name, right? And you would say, any Bible student would say, oh, yeah, that is a definite proof of prophecy. That's a proof that Jesus is, that the Bible is true. That's a proof that God was speaking, right? These things are proofs that definitely the Old Testament is inspired, because it's prophecy. If something is prophetic and it actually comes to pass as said, it is by definition prophecy. If it's true prophecy, I would say it's from God. But that being said, I would say with that, it's sort of like, oh, well, but we know it can't be prophecy because there is no such thing as prophecy. So it has to be another author because it's too specific to Cyrus. And it's like, no, you're just an unbeliever. You just don't believe. And that's my problem with a lot of Christians. They get their sort of information about the Bible, right, from high textual critics. They get it from unbelievers. A lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them are unbelievers. They don't believe the Bible. Bart Ehrman, he used to be a Christian, right? He's experientially unbelieving now, and he's a high textual critic. He's the New Testament critic. He doesn't accept most of the books of Paul. He thinks they're not written by Paul. He doesn't think Isaiah 40 to 55 is written by Isaiah. Obviously, he doesn't think, that's sort of his main problem. And again, Christians are eating this stuff up because they're getting it from unbelievers. That's the problem. And I think dispensationalists should go against that. They should stick on the literal meaning of the text, the literal meaning of prophecy. I mean, dude, if you think prophecy is going to happen as intended in the future, why would you ever accept something that says it wasn't written by the person who says it was written by? I mean, at that point, why even believe any of the Bible? If it explicitly says the prophecy of Isaiah in the start of the book, and it never says anyone else, why would you assume anything else? I really don't like that. So that was just my rant. The NIV, I said before, I don't like the NIV. I think the NIV is good to just read through, and so just sort of get like a general idea, good for Old Testament text, sort of get the story. But ultimately, I'm not a big fan of it. I think in the New Testament, I don't think it translates the Greek as accurately as it should have. You're probably off getting a better translation of WEB, NKJV. NASB is one of the most accurate to the Greek, although I think there are some liberties that they have with some stuff, like they say being saved, and they say practice sin and stuff like that. So I'm not a big fan of it. And NIV is very bad with how it handles Exodus 34 and Numbers 14. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think most of the time it's not great, but if you're just trying to get a general meaning of the story, right? If you're just trying to read through it and you don't want to go through that, because I will admit the KJV English, I like the KJV, but even then, it's too rigid. And so if you just want to read the text naturally, and you're not really like trying to study it too in depth, I think NIV is fine. But hey, Layman's here finally.
Hey, PB, thank you for doing this series. I hear myself.
Well, hold on. Hold on. Okay. Yeah, no, it's because I have the.
Now he just kicked himself. By the way, I saw somebody trying to fanboy for Haruzen. They're saying, why don't you debate Haruzen? That's what they're saying to PB. So I want to say, well, why don't Haruzen formally debate me? You know? And I don't know what else is going in the chat. But yeah.
Okay, there it
Did
is.
you hear what I just said, PB?
What did you say?
I said I saw people in the chat, Haruzen and somebody else saying, why don't you formally debate Haruzen? And I said, well, why don't Haruzen formally debate me? You know?
Well, yeah. I think I said before, I'm not interested in debate. Because
Right.
I think it's, well, first of all, I think with these people it's sort of pointless. But even then, well, this is sort of a tangent. Well, they're sort of criticizing the dispensationalism. Again, you don't even have to watch this series. You don't actually have to be a dispensationalist. I know that, like, right. That's important. This channel is not called the Dispensationalist Layman Seminary. It's just called Layman Seminary. You don't have to be. In fact, you could watch this series coming from someone who believes in futurism, as eschatology. But you could be whatever. The point is that you're learning hermeneutical principles. You're learning how people come to conclusions. And I think you should watch, because whether you would like it or not, dispensationalists, you have to admit, they try to be careful with the text. They're very sharp. And so there's something to learn from that that people don't get.
So can you see my screen that I'm sharing?
Right. Yeah.
All right. I don't even know if this one exists. I think it does. All right. Let's see here. So well, that one's not popping up.